Birds migrate because they are just trying to survive and to feel safe so that way they can breed from one ground to the next. So that's why they're constantly migrating. If they choose a place to land, that is where they found the most valuable resources for their entire flock to benefit from. That can be the same for climate refugees.
The reason why people are coming often is due to fleeing from situations where climate change has displaced them.
2 degrees Celsius, our world warms up, and you see most of the world isn't able to thrive or survive in their current areas. Climate refugees and migratory patterns of birds have some interconnectedness, right?
The truth is that we're all connected in climate change.
The environmental field is at a point where we're realizing that everything is connected, that we're all part of the ecosystem. This is all knowledge that was known and passed down in indigenous cultures, like the whole idea that we're all related. It took a while for the larger environmental movement, which is like 90% white, to accept that like indigenous knowledge as fact. And it took like studies and peer-reviewed studies in order for it to be accepted as fact. An example of the indigenous knowledge that was ignored. Indigenous people were living on the meadows in Yellowstone, and they were taking care of it and making sure that all the natural processes that are necessary for that meadow to thrive and to be like this biodiversity hotspot, that they were continued. So they would do like controlled burns to mimic what would normally happen. And the white settlers didn't quite understand this, and they wanted to stop the burns. So they did that, and that in turn made like all these evergreens just start taking over the whole area and destroy the meadows, which was needed for the species that lived there. And it wasn't until 100 years later that they were like, oh, whoops, we shouldn't have done that. Let's spend all this time, energy, and money bringing back the meadows.
When we are thinking about solutions to climate change, we often think of the experts, the scientists, the politicians. What are they telling us to do? But the voices of people on the front lines are not often included or even mentioned. So in order to address climate change, we have to actually talk to and listen to the people that are facing these challenges head on. I was working directly with Kekchi Mayan communities in the highlands of Guatemala who had these beautifully diverse agroecosystems that were based on traditional forms of agriculture, and really trying to show the important role of these indigenous farmers in providing services for biodiversity and creating habitat for migratory birds.
Different types of biologic diversity, such as a diversity in plants and animals, it usually signifies a really healthy environment. I don't think that's too different than people. I think that diversity, bringing different people to the table, you oftentimes comes up with better solutions.
We have to make space for difference. We have to allow for abundance. We have to agree that disagreement is growth. Like, we can't just all assimilate for, efficiency's sake. We need to be expansive and bring all the ideas into the room. If you think about the ecology of a river, it needs to wind, right? Because it needs to have that separation and that confluence. In order to make capitalism work better, all these rivers were made into channels, right? And then you have all the things that was destroyed from the river that affects the ecology of the land then. So you have all this runoff and whatever. Using that model, you need to have divergent and then convergent thoughts in order to have a process that works, that like includes different thoughts, that includes different voices.
All of those different reasons and thought processes actually allow us to come up with better solutions because we have outside the box thinking. When you're kind of in a monolith, all of the thought process will stay concise. But bringing in new people and new thoughts really will help diversify conservation. And it's really important, especially with the complex challenges that we're facing now, because the solutions that we've had for multiple years aren't fixing those problems.
That's what's happened in these nonprofits. Instead of allowing for difference, making space for difference, having conversations that like are abundant, we always want to like go the straight, narrow route, right? We made it into a channel. We're like, okay, you can come in as a person of color, but you have to do the things the way we say that it's done. And so you don't have this diversity of thought anymore. You have this assimilation. Like you want my gender, you want my sexuality, you want my skin color in the room, but only if I do things exactly how you prescribed me to do them. So I'm no longer in the room.
You can't just talk about CO2 emissions. That misses and actually erases the entire story. So we need to take the environmental movement from a more historical lens and stop putting Band-Aids on, but actually start to address root causes to the problems that we're facing. The reason that we're in the climate situation that we're in today is because of settler colonialism, from capitalism, from patriarchy, from all of these huge systems that are really, really difficult to change. It's about social problems. They're about power, collecting resources. It's about consolidating wealth. You know, those are the problems that we face.
I'm a Hispanic individual myself, and in the community that I was raised in, it was diverse, lots of Hispanics. But as I've kind of gone through my career and gone through college, I've seen that there's less and less diversity within conservation.
I think it's like 88% of workers are white and 95% of board members are white in environmental fields, despite, I think we're up to like 43% people of color in the United States, or something like that. And, after the murder of George Floyd, a lot of the white-led organizations were like, hey, we have to, diversify. But they were focused on the diversity, but not the equity, not the inclusion, not the justice. And so they wanted to get people who looked different than them at the table, but the table wasn't ready for them. Their inputs haven't been respected. Every time I get a new manager, I have to prove myself again. Because my institutional knowledge just from being around and my background knowledge from living the way I have isn't enough. I need degrees, which I can't afford. There's just not a lot of trusting BIPOC individuals to know what they know.
One of the barriers that I encountered when I first entered the job force was actually getting an interview for a job. When I reached out to industry professionals to get advice on my resume, they recommended adding 3 things in my resume. 1 was to add the word U.S. passport. 2 was to add the words English as my first language. And then 3, to add a hobby such as rafting. Those 3 items were not things that my colleagues had to add. And I think that to take those things actually out of my resume and to actually highlight the different background and the cultural background that I bring to job positions was something that really empowered me later on in life.
It was during my master's degree, I was defending my thesis and trying to graduate to go on to do my PhD. And I actually had a committee member pull me aside and say, hey, I understand that you're having a really hard time getting your master's thesis published and through committee. And it was actually another committee member who was giving me a hard time and actually discriminating against me.
I think that BIPOC are underrepresented in these fields because it hasn't necessarily been the safest place for us to make mistakes or to learn on our own. Traditionally, safety, just like birds, is the number one thing, right? We're just trying to stay safe. And not be in the spotlight as much. And I think the tide is turning these days, and we're louder. With a lot of voices comes power. And I think that we've reached the brink as the BIPOC community to want to speak louder, and we've been empowered to do that.
I would say that there is not a lot of representation. However, that is really starting to change. So there's organizations that have emerged, especially since George Floyd. So Hunters of Color, Minority Outdoor Alliance, those are all partners of ours that we are working together with. Even here locally, Colorado Treks, which is focused on getting youth from BIPOC community out to the outdoors and specifically engaging in hunting and fishing.
As a woman of color in a highly male-dominated field, I bring my praxis, my worldview, my identity, and my history with me to confront issues that I face in the workplace, issues that I'm facing in leveraging voices in support of Indigenous people. So it has everything to do with how I approach my work. And I think trusting myself is one of the most hardest things, but also something that has kept me going, is I know I belong here and that my people have been doing this work for a really long time. So it does ground me.
I think what would be different if there was better BIPOC representation in this field in conservation and environmentalism is a more holistic approach to how we tackle all of our intersectional issues. We cannot combat climate change without a focus on water. We can't advocate for water without bringing in our neighbors and the people that have traditionally stewarded this land.
If you do inclusion and equity right, it rises all boats. Like, anything that you do to improve the inclusion at your organization will make things that much easier for even like white, cisgender, heterosexual, abled folks to navigate it.
Ultimately, what I'm hoping is to use the privilege that I have, the resources I have, to center the voices of Indigenous people and other communities of color, and help create space, help create opportunities for dialogue. I know how to utilize my privilege and my power to benefit people who don't always get the stage.
I'm here and I'm going to take up as much space as I can, but those people in positions of power that have traditionally held power in the past and today need to step aside. My job is to bring my community along and make our voices louder, so that way we take up as much space as possible. But it is not my job to secede power. That's somebody else's job.
You have to be willing to ruffle some feathers, because it's going to happen. Like, especially in environmental nonprofits, they haven't been asked to do this before. It's relatively new that they're asked to actually include us as complete beings. So I think that coming in authentically and speaking your mind and kind of demanding a place at the table, and not just like a place, but like a speaking place.
And trust yourself, trust your voice, and don't let anybody edit what you say or make you feel like you have to leave part of who you are at the door. You should be able to fully show up for who you are, for what your story is.
Everything is interconnected, right? From water, climate, wildlife. We're all connected. Birds can be a telling species. They tell us about the health of the environment, right? If there aren't birds there, then it's not necessarily a healthy habitat because there aren't resources for them to survive off of. With temperatures erratically changing, we've definitely taken an egocentric approach instead of ecocentric. And I think that we're circling back to be ecocentric. It will take a lot of time and persistence and commitment to one another instead of that individualistic approach.
You know, you may be the first, but you have to make sure you're not the last. So anything you can do to change things up while you're there is only going to make things easier for the next person coming behind you.